Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on logging and file integrity monitoring in the context of compliance regulation. My name is Kishore Veswani, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ControlCase. I really appreciate the time you've taken today to listen on this webinar on logging and file integrity monitoring in the context of various compliance regulations. A few housekeeping items before we get started. As we go through the session today, please feel free to type in the chat window if you are not being able to see my slides or hear the voice, and our moderators will look into any technical issues. Number two, a copy of this slide deck as well as a recording of this webinar will be provided to everybody next week. Also, you can go to our past webinars as well as sign up for future webinars by going to www.controlcase.com. That being said, we expect this webinar to run anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, and we will have ample time for questions after that. So please feel free to type your questions in the questions window as we go along, and we will make sure we answer the questions in the order we receive them as we go along. That being said, let's get into the meat of the presentation today. Our agenda will include going through the introduction about ControlCase, talking about certifications, talking about the relevance of logging, talking about the components of a logging and a file integrity monitoring solution, some of the challenges we see out there, and a Q&A for any questions that you may have. A little bit about ControlCase. We focus exclusively on IT compliance. We are your partner in the IT compliance process and ensure that we are working to ensure compliance is accurate, automated, but also a streamlined process as we work with our customers from a compliance perspective. We are focused on the following IT compliance and certification regulations predominantly that exist out there. Let's move to the next section about the different compliance regulations that exist out there that we'll be talking a little bit about. First of all is PCI DSS, and PCI DSS refers to payment card data security standards that are really guidelines for ensuring protection of cardholder data as it goes through the payment chain. So any company that processes, stores, or transmits credit card data is in scope for PCI DSS. And the way it'll all tie together is that logging and monitoring is a requirement of PCI DSS, as we will look through later. FISMA is the Federal Information Security Management Act. Think of FISMA as the federal regulations around the requirements for companies to ensure that they're complying with information security guidelines. It ensures that appropriate accountability and security protections are there for companies that do business with the government as well as for the federal government itself. And it ensures that a mandatory set of processes and procedures are in place for any information that touches federal entities or touches companies that provide services to federal entities. HIPAA, so PCI talked about credit card information, FISMA talked about federal information, HIPAA talks about healthcare information. And this was an act that was passed by Congress in 1996, but it continues to be a very relevant regulation that exists today. And it really looks at security and privacy to ensure protection and confidential handling of PHI or protected health information. The next standard is the ISO 27000 series. This is a more general purpose standard, and unlike PCI, FISMA, and HIPAA, which focus on certain verticals, which is healthcare, credit card, and federal, ISO really focuses on ensuring that companies have a management framework for ensuring information security and compliance within the organization. And so it's a more broad reaching regulation or a standard out there. So these four regulations we talked about, PCI, FISMA, HIPAA, as well as ISO that we talked about, really cover a spectrum or a sample set of regulations that exist out there. And now we will talk about how logging and monitoring ties back to these regulations. So first of all, when we talk about logging and monitoring, look at the different regulations that I referenced, as well as the coverage area that exists out there. Typically, when we say logging and monitoring, that includes logging, 24/7 monitoring, and ensuring that there's appropriate archival of log data as you go through it. The second aspect of logging and monitoring that also ties back to many of these regulations is the change management and monitoring. So logs and file integrity monitoring alerts would generally generate alerts based on correlation logics that exist out there. And the change management process is extremely important because when logging and monitoring alerts are generated, the first thing that needs to be identified is if there is a clear entry in the change management system for an expected event. So something that a log management system would identify can be broadly categorized into things that were expected based on expected changes within the environment, or not if they were not expected changes. If they are not in response to expected changes, then there is an escalation to an incident management process to investigate why anomalies were generated as identified by the log files. That's where we get into the incident management system or the incident management process. And when we talk about incidents, they really focus on ensuring that the company in question who has identified logs that could be suspicious is following a well-articulated process of responding to an anomaly that was found from a log management system. So you're monitoring, you're detecting, you're certainly reporting and responding, and finally, there should be a final approval or a resolution to why an alert was generated from a log management system if it was not in relation to an existing change management process after an investigation of incident management has been completed. So we talked about the various regulations. We talked about the various components of logging and monitoring that tie back to these regulations, which were logging and file integrity monitoring, change management, as well as incident management. And we talked in the context of PCI, FISMA, HIPAA, and ISO. Next, let's spend the bulk of our remaining set of time on specifically what are the components of a log management solution. And we will go through each one of these in a little bit more detail, but it generally starts with making sure you have an asset list, making sure you have a logging and monitoring matrix, that you have alarms and daily reports that are being looked at on an ongoing basis. Then there are dashboards. Then there is triangulation based on any issues that were found, i.e. the incidents that I mentioned, and then an updated asset list, which then completes the whole cycle. And we will go through each of these in a little bit more detail. In-scope asset list. It is extremely important to ensure that there is a baseline of what are the assets that are in scope. Because once you know what are the assets and what are the important assets, then you can make determinations whether A, are those assets reporting log, B, are the alerts that are being generated relevant. Number two, once we have an asset list, we should be able to tell which are the assets that are reporting and which are the assets that are not reporting. Then you got to have a logging and monitoring matrix, which is what are the important trigger points? How can those trigger points be initiated by which type of log? And then which specific compliance use case does that trigger point tie back to? So what's the trigger point? What's the source of the log? And how does it tie back to which specific use case? Next, there will be alarms generated, and it is important to ensure that alarms are more of a 24/7 by 365 reporting activity more than the next piece, which is daily reports, which is more of a daily function. So there are certain things that require an alarm and an immediate investigation, and there are other things that can be looked at from a daily report perspective. Next, you can move on to a centralized dashboard and ensure that your customers and your stakeholders, which is your internal customers and your internal IT group, if you're running a log management solution, have access to a centralized dashboard. And you, as the compliance and security function, also have a centralized dashboard. So a lot of data can be looked at in a summary format using dashboards like you're seeing on the screen. Once all that is done, we got to make sure that we are ensuring that the asset list is not looked as a fixed component, that it is an ongoing component that is updated periodically. And so updating the asset list using triangulation is an extremely important aspect of what we do on an ongoing basis as part of a well-streamlined log management system. And that means if you are seeing things in the vulnerability scan results that are not reporting logs, or vice versa, or things that are in either one of them but not in your asset list, that should generate triggers and alerts on that your asset list is not updated and needs to be updated. So we went through a whole bunch of steps that typically would include good components of a logging and monitoring solution. And I'll again summarize them. First of all, we need to ensure that there is an asset list. Those asset lists then need to be looked at from a point that they are accurately reporting logs. You also need a logging and monitoring matrix, which says what are the important alerts and what are the important daily reports which are being generated from what type of assets. All this information should be available on a dashboard. Then you got to ensure that you are doing any discrepancy triangulation to ensure that all the latest assets are reporting. I used the example that if you have vulnerability scan results for an asset that's not in your asset list and is not reporting, then that asset should be added and investigated as part of an in-scope asset list for the future. And so these are common components of a good logging and monitoring solution that companies have implemented to ensure they remain compliant to various regulations. As we get towards the latter part of this discussion, let's talk about some of the challenges that exist in the logging and monitoring space. One of the most common challenges out there are long deployment cycles. There are lots of assets. The larger the organization, the more the number of assets, and the more complicated it is to ensure that all the logs are reporting from these assets, B, ensuring the asset inventory itself is updated. And C, ensuring that the right type of alerts are coming from these assets. And so think of if you have a large volume of assets and you're looking at all these different data points, it could take a long time to deploy a new logging and file integrity monitoring solution. Number two is skills to manage the product. It is extremely important to ensure that logging and file integrity monitoring is looked at as a work in progress and a continuous improvement piece, which requires skill sets to maintain versus just a once deploy and done type of project, because signatures change, assets keep on changing, the product itself keeps on getting updated, and so it's important to ensure that the skill set, whether internal or external, to manage the product is up to date. Logging and monitoring has different components. One is infrastructure, which is an important component, but you also have other components like file integrity monitoring, syslog, 24/7 by 365 monitoring, that all add up to a challenge that all these pieces need to work in a coherent manner. The number of regulations are increasing, budgets always keep on decreasing, and more has to be done with less, which also usually poses a challenge and typically requires a solution of automation so that more can be done with less. So I talked a little bit about the different regulations. I talked about the different logging and monitoring components. We talked about some of the challenges we have seen in the market space out there when it comes to ensuring that log management is happening appropriately and in a streamlined manner. We do at ControlCase have a solution for ensuring that we can collect logs and keep customers compliant to various regulations that exist out there. That typically has multiple components to it. And this could, and our solution is probably very similar to a lot of other solutions out there. So these are typical third-party solutions that exist out there, and they typically have multiple components, but 3 components are most relevant out there when it comes to common solutions. The first one is you as the customer have your footprint out there. That could be in a data center, it could be in the cloud, or it could be a mix of it. So you have your infrastructure footprint out there in different environments. That's number one. Number two, you also have different types of assets, such as servers, workstations, network devices, and security devices like Active Directory and so forth that exist in your location. So what you as customers have on your side is a very diverse set of infrastructure that exists with a very diverse set of environments in there. And so on the left-hand side, you have that. Then we as a service provider or a company like us who provides a log management solution typically has one of 2 methods that exist out there. A, we have our appliance that exists out there that would form the central repository of collecting logs from your environment. Or the other option is to have agents on your servers that over the web moves, or over the internet moves logs directly to our third piece, which is our security operations center, which is looking at logs on an ongoing basis. The security operations center typically has dashboards. These dashboards are accessible to our analysts who are looking at this on an ongoing basis to ensure that we are monitoring alerts and doing the daily review of logs. But number two, we are also providing that dashboard, as do most service providers provide the dashboard to customers to be able to look at those logs on an ongoing basis. So our solution, just like many other service providers, would include your location where the logs are coming from, service provider, which is us, collecting the logs and transporting them to our security operations center, which is reviewing logs on an ongoing basis. So that is our solution, and that is also a fairly typical solution for a third-party provider where companies are outsourcing the log management piece to a security company and compliance company like us. Well, that gets us to the end of our presentation. At this point, I see a few questions. I will answer them, but if you have any other questions, please type them, and I will make sure we answer them in the context of the order that we receive them. The first question is logging and file integrity monitoring required across all compliance regulation? And the answer is that depends on the regulation in question. Some regulations like PCI DSS actually spell out that file integrity needs to be there as a component within the overall logging and monitoring solution. In other cases like HIPAA, while they don't spell out that requirement, it is certainly a best practice that we have seen out there and should be followed on an ongoing basis to ensure that things are being done in a streamlined manner. The second question is around logging and monitoring in the cloud, and how does that differ from on-premise environments? So that's another great question. When we talk about logging and monitoring in the cloud, I will use an example of Amazon Web Services. Because in the cloud, there is, I guess, native cloud-based infrastructure, as well as infrastructure that companies are managing themselves. You're really getting logs from your own virtual assets, as well as you could get, you could get log feeds from your cloud provider. So as an example, in AWS, you have incoming feeds from both AWS for inherent infrastructure, as well as you have your individual assets also reporting logs. And you certainly want to ensure that you are correlating logs between these two types of assets that come in, or logs that come in from these two types of assets. That was the last question I had. Thank you once again. We will be sending out a copy of these slides, a recording of this webinar. And again, please feel free to go to www.controlcase.com to listen in on any of the old presentations we have had and to sign up for any upcoming ones. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice day.